It was the kind of afternoon the village of Crowthorne prided itself on. The early summer sun filtered through the rose-draped trellises of the vicarage garden, warming the neatly trimmed hedges and polished silverware laid out for the annual fete. Bunting fluttered gently in the breeze. Women in floral dresses and broad-brimmed hats clutched cups of tea, and the scent of fresh scones mingled with honeysuckle and lavender. Miss Jane Marple, seated beneath a striped parasol near the hydrangeas, sipped her tea with measured delight. At 86, her lace gloves were still pristine, her hat appropriately modest, and her eyes, those sharp, twinkling blue eyes, took in everything. "This is simply perfect, Reverend," cooed Mrs. Lavinia Akers, the vicar's formidable sister, as she plopped another lemon-drizzle square onto her already teetering plate. "Not a single thing out of place, not like that unfortunate business at the Wellingtons' harvest supper, when old Major Hexton—" "Do hush, Lavinia," the Reverend Alton snapped gently. "That was years ago." "Nonetheless," Miss Marple murmured with a sweet smile, "the Major's unfortunate fondness for elderberry wine did make for quite a scene." As laughter bubbled around her, Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the far edge of the garden where a group had gathered under the gazebo. There stood a covered easel, a surprise unveiled later that afternoon, part of a charity auction. The local artist, Mr. Oliver Nash, had promised a new work, a portrait of one of the village's most prominent ladies, though no one knew who. "Must be Mrs. Carswell," whispered Kitty Denham, a young woman with too much rouge and too little sense. "She paid for the frame herself, I heard." "Rubbish," said her companion, Simon Kerridge, a sullen man with a limp and an air of permanent discontent. "It'll be Mrs. Eversham. The woman collects portraits like moths to a lampshade." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "People do love to speculate." She, however, had noticed the absence of the artist himself. Mr. Nash was a dramatic man, partial to cravats and long speeches, yet the unveiling was due in minutes and he hadn't been seen. Nor, Miss Marple noted, had Miss Clarissa Nash, his sister, housekeeper and frequent critic, made her usual rounds of dryly sarcastic small talk. Then came the moment. Reverend Alton stepped up with a brief thank-you speech and invited the crowd toward the gazebo. There was a polite hush, a clearing of throats, the flurry of a white linen cloth pulled aside. A collective gasp. The portrait was beautiful, technically flawless, in fact, but it was not the subject that arrested the village's breath. It was the smear. A deep red stain marred the lower corner of the canvas. Still wet, still dripping. "What on earth?" cried Mrs. Carswell, stepping back as though the painting might leap at her. "It's blood," said Kitty Denham, eyes wide and pale. "No," said Simon flatly. "It can't be." But the rusted tang in the air said otherwise. And suddenly a voice rang out, hoarse, panicked, from the hedgerow. "It's Oliver! Someone help! He's dead!" Gasps turned to shrieks, teacups fell to the grass, and the peaceful afternoon shattered like porcelain on stone. Miss Marple stood, calmly set her cup down, and began walking toward the hedge. It was going to be that sort of summer, after all. The cries had drawn nearly everyone toward the hedge at the far end of the garden, where a narrow gate led to the old orchard beyond. Miss Marple, moving with unassuming briskness for a woman of her years, followed the swell of people but kept to the side, unobtrusive, listening. They found Oliver Nash lying face down in the grass, beneath a twisted apple tree, his cravat soaked with blood. The crimson pooled beneath his shoulder, soaking into the parched earth. The back of his head was matted, as though struck by something heavy and swift. It was Kitty Denham who had screamed, though it was Mrs. Carswell who fainted. Reverend Alton, white-faced, muttered something about calling the police. "No one is to leave," he added with surprising authority, though it quavered on the final word. "Please, everyone, stay within the garden. The police will need to speak to us all." Miss Marple crouched slowly, knees crackling. She didn't touch the body, heaven forbid, but looked carefully at the surrounding grass. A crushed cigarette end, lipstick stained, lay not far from Oliver's left hand. Someone had been here before, or after him. She noted it, but said nothing. People often discarded their intentions along with their cigarette butts. "He must have come through the gate before the unveiling," murmured Mrs. Evesham, whose towering feathered hat now drooped with the tension. "Clarissa said he'd taken the portrait out this morning. It was already set up, wasn't it?" "Yes, yes," said someone else. "But who would do such a thing, and why ruin the painting with, oh, blood?" Miss Marple heard the sharp intake of breath beside her and turned slightly. Clarissa Nash had appeared from the vicarage, her grey dress pressed and plain, as ever, but her face drawn. She moved past the onlookers with a quietness that spoke more of grief than performance. She knelt beside her brother, did not cry, did not touch him, only stared. Then she turned to the vicar. "I'll wait for the inspector inside." A constable arrived first, a local lad who knew everyone and looked appalled at the scene. By the time Inspector Crail reached the vicarage, a dour, thick-set man with a moustache like a weather-beaten broom, the mood had shifted from hysteria to hushed speculation. The fete had ended, replaced by a tight knot of villagers muttering in corners of the garden. The inspector was quick to impose order. Everyone who had attended the party was to remain on the premises until they'd spoken with him. Oliver's body was cordoned off with garden chairs and bunting. Miss Marple, now seated once more with her tea gone cold, observed quietly. Simon Carriage was the first to speak out loud what many had already thought. "Well, it's obvious, isn't it? Someone didn't like the painting." Kitty gave a nervous giggle, which earned her a disapproving glance from Clarissa Nash, who had returned to stand in the shadow of a willow tree, arms folded tightly. Mrs. Carswell huffed. "That's preposterous. It's just a portrait. Art doesn't get you murdered, Mr. Carriage." But Miss Marple raised an eyebrow at that. Art, she knew, revealed far more than the painter intended, and Oliver Nash had been no fool. He had a cruel streak in his brush, she thought. He painted people not as they saw themselves, but as they were. And few things unsettled the English more than the unvarnished truth. Inspector Crail began his interviews with the obvious witnesses, Clarissa, the vicar, and then the few who had lingered near the gazebo when the painting was unveiled. When he reached Miss Marple, he greeted her with a nod. "Miss Marple, I dare say you're familiar with scenes like this." "I'm afraid one sees more than one would wish, Inspector," she replied gently, "though in this case I fear Mr. Nash's death may be less a mystery of violence and more a matter of social truth." Crail looked puzzled. "Meaning?" "Well," Miss Marple said mildly, "he did rather enjoy exposing people. It is not beyond imagination that someone resented it enough to stop him." The inspector frowned, flipping open his notebook. "Do you know if he had quarrels recently?" "I believe Mr. Carriage was quite displeased with a prior sketch," Miss Marple offered. "It depicted him in military uniform, but rather emphasized the injury that kept him from active service. Some found it unflattering." Crail made a note. "Anyone else?" "Mrs. Evesham's daughter posed for him once. The portrait was never displayed. I heard whispers she begged him not to show it, and I gather Clarissa and Oliver had their differences." "Siblings often do." Crail grunted. "Yes. Well, I'll speak with all of them." As he moved away, Miss Marple noticed Clarissa was no longer in the garden. The vicar's wife, delicate and pale with worry, appeared at her side. "I've made up the study for the inspector, but I'm quite at sea. Jane, what do you think happened?" Miss Marple sighed. "Someone saw something in that painting they couldn't bear to be known, perhaps not even by themselves." She looked toward the canvas, now covered once more by the vicar's tablecloth. But she remembered the portrait clearly, the subject's features artfully blurred, the background detailed to perfection, a drawing room with distinctive wallpaper and a window partly ajar. A face caught in a moment of alarm, one hand reaching off frame as if toward something unseen. The oddest thing, she thought, was how fresh the painting looked. Too fresh. And the smear of blood had not struck the center or face of the subject but the corner, at an angle. A careless brush, not a targeted strike. Miss Marple walked quietly back to the gazebo, unnoticed. The constable posted nearby looked uncertain but didn't stop her. She examined the pedestal beside the easel. A fine hairline trail of blood ran down one leg. Not sprayed or flung, but fallen. She stooped and found it, a small, flat tin, half concealed behind the drape. Paint thinner. That was not standard for an oil painting displayed outdoors. Nor would it be left behind by an artist as meticulous as Oliver Nash, unless someone else had used it, or needed to use it, in something else. Faint but sharp. Not just blood. The smell of almonds. Bitter. Chemical. She straightened, eyes narrowing slightly. Back in the orchard, the constable was guarding the scene with solemn stillness, and from inside the vicarage, the murmur of interrogation continued. She caught sight of Clarissa, now seated on a bench, her hands perfectly still in her lap. Too still. Not the stillness of grief, but of calculation. The painting had not just shown something, it had threatened to expose something, and someone, Miss Marple thought, had been willing to kill to keep it buried. The question was, what secret lay in the portrait that made it so dangerous? And why had the portrait blushed red only after Oliver was dead? The answer, she suspected, would come not in the brush strokes, but in the human impulses behind them. She folded her hands. The village was already whispering, and whispering, she knew, was how the truth began to leak. The garden had emptied now, the remaining villagers lingering only in small, uneasy clusters near the vicarage porch or the once joyful gazebo, now a place of sombre curiosity. Miss Marple found herself sitting quietly on a bench near the hydrangeas, her hands folded in her lap as the inspector continued his interviews inside. The stillness of the moment seemed to sharpen her senses, and she allowed her thoughts to drift back over the afternoon's events. Oliver Nash had been a man who enjoyed shaking up the village's comfortable facades. His art was more than mere likeness. It was a subtle exposure of hidden truths, a teasing of the undercurrents beneath polite society. The painting, with its almost imperceptible distress in the subject's face and the careful but telling background details, had been meant to reveal something important, something that had upset more than one person. Miss Marple's gaze fell on the small tin of paint thinner she had spotted by the easel. It seemed odd that it had been left behind, and the faint scent of bitter almonds, cyanide, still lingered in her memory. She knew from years of quiet observation and reading between the lines that a chemical like that was no accident. But who had access to such a substance in a village like Crowthorne? And why was it found beside the painting? She rose and made her way toward the vicarage, where the inspector was just concluding a tense conversation with Mrs. Eversham, the elegant widow whose late husband had once been a major landowner in the area. Mrs. Eversham's eyes were sharp and calculating, betraying little emotion. "Inspector," Miss Marple said softly, "might I have a word?" Crail looked surprised but nodded. "Of course, Miss Marple." They stepped into the shade of the porch, away from the ears of the others. "I noticed the paint thinner left near the easel," she began. "That suggests someone was tampering with the portrait, perhaps after it had been set up." Crail frowned. "Tampering? You think someone was trying to alter it? Or to destroy evidence?" Miss Marple said gently. "Mr. Nash was careful, but someone else was careless enough to leave this behind." The inspector nodded slowly. "We found a small knife near the body, with dried blood on the blade. The cause of death seems to be a blow to the head, but there's no sign of a struggle." "Then the attack was swift," Miss Marple mused. "And from behind." As they spoke, Clarissa Nash appeared on the steps, her expression unreadable. "Miss Nash," the inspector called, "we'd like to speak with you again." She nodded, glancing briefly at Miss Marple before following Crail inside. Miss Marple remained standing, her mind turning over the puzzle. Oliver's sister was an enigma. Quiet, restrained, yet with a steeliness that hinted at deep feelings. Siblings often carried grudges that others could not perceive, and Clarissa's cool demeanor was no exception. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Alton, approached hesitantly. "Jane, I've been thinking about the portrait. You mentioned it revealed truths that some might find disturbing. What kind of truth do you think could provoke murder?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not all truths are spoken, Margaret. Sometimes they live in the shadows of our pasts, waiting for a careless brush to expose them." Her words hung in the warm afternoon air, heavier than the scent of summer roses. Inside, the inspector had begun his formal questioning. Clarissa Nash spoke with measured calm, describing her brother as a man passionate about his art but prone to conflicts, particularly with those he painted. "He never spared anyone," she admitted. "If he thought you had something to hide, he would find a way to put it on canvas." "And did he have enemies?" Crail pressed. Clarissa hesitated. "More than one, but I can't say which might have wanted to harm him." As the interviews continued, Miss Marple wandered through the house, her eyes lingering on photographs and knick-knacks that spoke of the Nash family's long presence in Crowthorne. In the study, a faint smell of paint and turpentine mingled with the scent of old paper and leather-bound books. She paused by a shelf lined with sketchbooks and carefully opened one at random. There, among portraits of village scenes and faces, was a small sketch of a young woman with a troubled expression, her eyes dark and wide, her hand raised in a subtle gesture of alarm. Miss Marple's heart quickened. The features were familiar. Kitty Denham. Why would Oliver Nash have sketched her in such a way, and why had she looked so anxious that day at the garden party? Her thoughts were interrupted by the inspector's voice behind her. "We found this in his pocket," Crail said, holding up a folded note. Miss Marple took the note carefully. It was written in a neat, firm hand. "Meet me by the orchard gate at 4. We must talk. It's urgent." No signature. She looked up at the inspector. 4 o'clock, the same time the unveiling was scheduled. Crail nodded. "We're trying to trace who sent it, but no one's come forward." Miss Marple's gaze shifted to the window where the orchard lay bathed in afternoon light. "Did anyone see Oliver leave the party before the unveiling?" she asked. The inspector shook his head. "Not that we know of. But it's possible." Miss Marple thought about the crushed cigarette end by the body, lipstick stained as if dropped in haste. Who was smoking at the garden party? She wondered aloud. The vicar's wife appeared in the doorway, overhearing. Mrs. Carswell was known for her discreet smoking habit, she said, though she'd never admit it. "Discreet indeed," said Miss Marple softly. "But discretion is not always enough to hide secrets." Her mind raced through the faces she had seen that afternoon. Mrs. Carswell's haughty glare, Simon Kerridge's bitterness, Kitty Denham's nervous flutter, Mrs. Eversham's polished reserve, Clarissa's cool detachment. Each had something to hide. Each had a stake in the portrait. Later, as the inspector prepared to question the villagers one by one, Miss Marple requested to speak privately with Clarissa again. In the quiet of the drawing-room, Clarissa's composure faltered just for a moment. "Oliver was obsessed with that portrait," she confessed. "He said it was the best work he'd ever done, but he was afraid to show it." "Why?" Miss Marple asked gently. Clarissa's eyes darkened. "Because it revealed more than just a face. It showed a truth the village wasn't ready to see." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And did you share his fears?" Clarissa looked away. "I loved my brother, but I knew some secrets should remain buried." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on her sister-in-law's trembling hands. Outside, the village was stirring with whispers and conjecture. The peaceful routine of Crowthorne had been shattered, and the gentle game of small-town gossip was already in full play. But beneath the chatter lay a deeper current of hidden resentments, old betrayals, and secrets tangled as tightly as the vines that climbed the garden walls. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her gloves. The answers were hidden not in loud accusations, but in quiet observation. The portrait was a key, and Oliver Nash's death a lock. She would need patience and the subtle art of reading human nature to find the door. As evening settled over the village, casting long shadows over the rose bushes and trimmed lawns, Miss Marple knew the investigation was only just beginning. As dusk deepened over Crowthorne, the village seemed to hold its breath. The earlier sun-dappled warmth had softened to a chill that crept through the open windows of the vicarage, where Inspector Crail was still deep in questioning. Miss Marple, her knitting forgotten in her lap, observed the shifting expressions of the assembled villagers. The weight of the day's events was settling heavily, and the threads of conversation tangled more thickly with every passing hour. The inspector called forth Mrs. Carswell first. The widow entered the room with a carefully measured grace, the faintest trace of rouge dusting her cheeks, as if the portrait's whispered truths had unsettled her composure as much as the rest. She gave Miss Marple a sidelong glance that was neither hostile nor warm. "I understand you were seen smoking earlier by the orchard gate," Crail began. Mrs. Carswell's lips pressed into a thin line. "I find it most improper to be scrutinized so closely, Inspector." "Just answering questions, madam," Crail said patiently. "Did you see anything unusual this afternoon? Anything that might help us?" Her eyes flickered briefly to the covered portrait in the corner of the room. "I was merely enjoying the fresh air. I saw Mr. Nash setting up the painting. It was unusual, unsettling even." "Unsettling how?" Miss Marple inquired softly. Mrs. Carswell hesitated, then, as if compelled by something more than duty, added, "There was a darkness to it, not just in the colors, but in the expression. It looked as if the subject were hiding a terrible secret." Miss Marple nodded, her mind quietly ticking over the words. "Secrets can weigh heavily," she murmured. From the corner, Simon Kerridge shifted restlessly. His presence had been quiet since the discovery of the body, but now his voice cut through the room. "If anyone had a reason to hate Oliver, it's me. That blasted sketch of mine. It was cruel, yes, but he deserved the truth. Not everyone likes being reminded of their failures." Crail looked sharply at him. "You were seen arguing with Mr. Nash last week." Kerridge shrugged. "A disagreement over the military commission, but that's hardly motive for murder." Clarissa Nash, standing near the window, tightened her grip on the curtain. Her calm facade was beginning to crack, and Miss Marple sensed the effort it took her to maintain it. As the evening darkened outside, the inspector summoned Kitty Denham. The young woman entered the room, with a fluttering nervousness, her hands wringing a delicate handkerchief. She glanced once toward Clarissa, who met her gaze with a cool steadiness that made Kitty quickly look away. "Miss Denham," Crail said kindly, "you were seen near the orchard gate around 4 o'clock. Did you see Mr. Nash then?" Kitty swallowed. "Yes, he asked me to meet him. He said there was something important he needed to tell me." "And what did he say?" Miss Marple asked gently. Kitty hesitated, her eyes wide. "He said the portrait, that it showed something about me, something I wanted to hide." I didn't understand. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Did he say what that was?" Kitty shook her head, biting her lip. "No, but he seemed very serious, afraid almost." The inspector jotted down notes, then asked, "Did anyone else know about this meeting?" Kitty glanced nervously at the others. "No. At least, I don't think so." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Kitty's face, a tapestry of fear and confusion. After Kitty left, Miss Marple stayed behind for a moment, turning her thoughts inward. The portrait, she realized, was a focal point of concealed truths, weaving connections between each person present. Oliver Nash had wielded his brush like a scalpel, cutting deep into lives that many preferred, left unexamined. Her eyes drifted once more to the covered canvas, where the secret lay hidden beneath the plain cloth. Later, as the village clock struck 9, the group was dispersed to their respective homes, though the mood remained heavy. Miss Marple took a slow walk through the garden, now quiet except for the rustling leaves and the occasional chirp of a restless bird. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. Turning, she found Clarissa Nash approaching, her expression weary but resolved. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "may I speak with you? Alone?" They moved toward a secluded corner near the old oak tree, the faint glow of lanterns casting long shadows. Clarissa's voice was low. "There's something I must tell you, something I've never said aloud." Miss Marple inclined her head, encouraging her. "My brother and I were close once," Clarissa began, "but his obsession with the portrait drove a wedge between us. He wanted to paint the truth, but some truths are dangerous. Our family history is complicated. There are things about our father that, if revealed, would ruin more than just reputations." Miss Marple listened intently, sensing the gravity beneath the words. "What sort of things?" she asked. Clarissa swallowed hard. Our father was not the man everyone believed him to be. There were debts, affairs, secrets of a very personal nature. Oliver had discovered letters, evidence that contradicted the village's cherished narratives. He wanted to expose it all through his art. "Did he share this with you?" Miss Marple probed gently. "He tried," Clarissa admitted, "but I begged him to stop. Some things are best left in the past." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And yet the portrait was to be unveiled today." "Yes," Clarissa said, eyes misting. "He said it was time, but he didn't realize how far others would go to protect their secrets." The admission settled heavily between them. Miss Marple placed a comforting hand on Clarissa's arm. "You're brave to share this. It helps us understand why the portrait mattered so much." Clarissa looked up, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you." They returned to the vicarage together, where the night's quiet was broken only by the distant barking of a dog. Inside, Inspector Crail was reviewing his notes when Miss Marple rejoined him. "Inspector," she said, "I believe the key lies not in the paint or the blood, but in the village's hidden past." Crail looked up, curious. The portrait threatened to unravel old lies and unveil truths long buried. The question is who stood to lose the most. Crail rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "And who had the opportunity?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the darkened garden beyond the window, and who felt cornered enough to silence Mr. Nash forever? As the night deepened, the village of Crowthorne seemed to hold its secrets tighter. But Miss Marple, with her patient watchfulness, was beginning to see the faint outlines of a story far more tangled than anyone suspected. The portrait that blushed red was more than a painting. It was a mirror reflecting the hidden shadows of the village, shadows that someone was desperate to keep from the light. And Miss Marple knew the game had only just begun. Morning arrived over Crowthorne with a pale light that filtered softly through the overcast sky, as if the village itself hesitated to wake from the uneasy slumber cast by Oliver Nash's death. The early hours were quiet, but charged with the tension of unanswered questions and eyes that now watched one another with suspicion rather than camaraderie. Miss Marple rose early, her routine undisturbed by the turmoil. Tea prepared, she settled by the window with her knitting, though her fingers worked almost absent-mindedly. Her mind was far from the simple patterns of yarn. It circled back repeatedly to the threads of the previous day's revelations: the portrait, the secret letters, Clarissa's confession, and Kitty Denham's nervous anxiety. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was the vicar's wife, Mrs. Alton, carrying a small tray with fresh scones and a pot of tea. "Good morning, Jane," she said with a tentative smile. "I thought you might like some company." Miss Marple returned the smile warmly. "Thank you, Margaret. I find tea always clarifies the mind." They sat together by the window, the garden just beginning to brighten with tentative bursts of early blooms. "I heard the inspector will be questioning the villagers again today," Mrs. Alton said, stirring her tea. "Do you think they'll find the killer soon?" Miss Marple considered. "It is rarely a matter of speed, but of patience. Sometimes the smallest detail unlocks the door." Margaret's eyes widened. "You mean like the paint thinner?" "Yes, or the note found in Oliver's pocket," Miss Marple replied softly. "But I suspect there are other details yet unnoticed." As the morning progressed, the vicarage filled again with the murmur of voices and footsteps. The inspector arrived shortly after, signaling that the day's investigation was to recommence. Miss Marple made her way to the study, where Crail was collecting statements. His eyes met hers briefly, a silent acknowledgement of her presence and contribution. "We're beginning with those closest to Mr. Nash," he said. "The villagers' stories have been inconsistent." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, "and inconsistencies often reveal more than straightforward answers." The first to be called was Mrs. Evesham. Her posture was regal, her expression polished, but Miss Marple detected a slight tremor in her voice as she recounted her whereabouts. "I was in the library," Mrs. Evesham said, "preparing for the upcoming village fete. I hardly saw Mr. Nash all afternoon." "But you did attend the garden party?" the inspector pressed. "Yes, but I kept mostly to myself. I'm not one for mingling." Miss Marple, however, noted a faint smudge of paint on Mrs. Evesham's cuff, an oddity for someone so fastidious. The vicar's wife noticed Miss Marple's glance and gave a slight nod. "Oliver was particular about who he allowed near his paintings," Mrs. Evesham said quietly. "He said certain people shouldn't see what he had revealed." Before more could be said, the door opened and Simon Kerridge entered, his brow furrowed. "I'd like to clarify something," he said abruptly. "There's been talk of a meeting between Oliver and Kitty Denham. I want to say I had no knowledge of it." Crail gave him a pointed look. "Do you deny seeing them together?" Simon's gaze flicked to Clarissa Nash, who was seated nearby, then back. "I saw Kitty near the orchard gate. That's all." Miss Marple caught the flicker of irritation in his eyes. Simon's bitterness towards Oliver was no secret, but it was more than mere professional jealousy that simmered beneath the surface. As the questioning continued, the pattern became clearer. Nearly everyone had secrets, and nearly everyone feared the portrait's unveiling. Later that morning, Miss Marple requested a private moment with Clarissa. They met once again in the vicarage garden, where the scent of blooming roses mingled with the freshness of early spring. Clarissa's composure was fragile today. "There's more I didn't tell you," she admitted. "Oliver was working on something beyond the portrait. He'd uncovered correspondence, letters from our father to various villagers." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Letters that could cause harm?" "Not just harm," Clarissa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Disgrace, financial ruin, the sort of scandal that changes lives." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And do you think someone knew of these letters?" Clarissa looked away. "I do. I fear someone went to great lengths to stop Oliver." As they spoke, a faint rustle came from the hedge behind them. Miss Marple turned, noting the presence of Kitty Denham lurking at the edge of the garden. Her hands twisted nervously. "Miss Denham," Miss Marple called gently, "would you care to join us?" Kitty hesitated but stepped forward, her face pale. I overheard you mention letters. I know of them. Oliver confided in me." Clarissa's eyes widened in surprise. "You did not tell me." Kitty shook her head, voice trembling. "He said it was safer if fewer knew." Miss Marple observed the interaction carefully. The delicate tension between the two women was palpable. "Do you know where these letters are now?" she asked. Kitty glanced toward the vicarage. Oliver kept them hidden in his study, beneath the false bottom of a drawer. "I found one yesterday, addressed to Mr. Kerridge." Simon Kerridge's name caused a ripple of unease. The afternoon found Miss Marple and the inspector sifting through Oliver's study. The false drawer bottom was carefully removed, revealing a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The first letter was indeed addressed to Simon Kerridge, containing hints of debts and threats to expose a shady deal that would ruin Kerridge's reputation. As Crail read aloud, Miss Marple's mind pieced together the fragile web of motives. The letters implicated several villagers, all tied to a network of debts, secrets, and betrayals. The portrait, then, was a veiled confession, a final statement from Oliver Nash. That evening, Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing-room, the portrait still covered, the letters resting on the table beside her. The pieces were falling into place, yet the true face of the murderer remained hidden beneath layers of village politeness and veiled threats. As shadows lengthened, a sudden knock at the door startled her. It was Mrs. Carswell, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled, her eyes wide with an urgency Miss Marple had not seen before. "I had to speak with you," she said breathlessly. "There's something you must know about the night of the murder." Miss Marple gestured for her to sit, her curiosity piqued. Mrs. Carswell's voice was low and tremulous. "I saw someone leaving the garden late that evening. Someone I recognized but did not want to admit at first." Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her knitting. "Who was it?" Mrs. Carswell's eyes darted to the window, then back. "It was the vicar himself." The revelation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Miss Marple studied Mrs. Carswell closely. "Why tell me this now?" "Because I feared it was a mistake," she whispered. "But it cannot be ignored." Miss Marple's mind raced. The vicar was a man well respected, seemingly detached from the village's intrigues. But secrets had a way of reaching even the most unlikely places. As night deepened, Miss Marple understood that the threads of this mystery were more tangled than she first imagined. The portrait that blushed red was a tapestry woven from deceit, fear, and human frailty. And the next move would require the sharpest observation and the keenest understanding of those hidden in plain sight. The candlelight flickered softly in the vicarage drawing-room as Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Carswell, the weight of her revelation settling heavily between them. Outside, the night wrapped the village of Crowthorne in a hushed stillness, as if even the stars were holding their breath. "I confess I was reluctant to say anything earlier," Mrs. Carswell admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "The vicar is a man of great standing. Everyone trusts him. But last night, when I saw him slip quietly through the garden gate shortly after dark, something about his manner was uneasy." Miss Marple folded her knitting with care. "Did you notice where he was headed?" Mrs. Carswell hesitated, then nodded. "Toward Oliver Nash's cottage, I think. It was a brief glimpse, and the shadows played tricks, but I'm fairly certain." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "And was he alone?" "No. Someone followed him, quick and silent, like a shadow itself. I couldn't make out who." The mystery deepened. The vicar, a man above suspicion, was now implicated by circumstance, and someone was shadowing him, unseen by all but a watchful widow. The following morning, Miss Marple rose with the dawn, her thoughts turning over Mrs. Carswell's confession as she prepared for the day ahead. The village seemed caught between normality and unease. The local shops bustled as usual, but conversations dropped to whispers when the name Oliver Nash surfaced. At the vicarage, Inspector Crail awaited, his expression grave. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Carswell's account has added a new layer. I intend to question the vicar again, discreetly." Miss Marple nodded. "It is wise. Sometimes the most upright men bear the heaviest burdens." Together they approached the vicar's study. The door opened before they could knock, and Reverend Alton stood framed in the doorway, his face pale but composed. "Inspector, Miss Marple, he said with a faint smile. To what do I owe this visit so early? Crail glanced at Miss Marple, who said quietly, Reverend, we must discuss your movements last night. Alton's smile faded. Of course. They settled in the study, the atmosphere thick with unspoken tension. Mrs. Carswell told us she saw you near Mr. Nash's cottage after dark, Crail began. Alton sighed, folding his hands. Yes, I went to speak with Oliver. We had a long-standing disagreement, though few knew of it. Miss Marple's gaze was steady. May I ask what the disagreement concerned? The vicar hesitated, then answered. Oliver was intent on revealing the darker parts of our village's history. Letters, secrets that could shatter many lives. I implored him to reconsider, to protect the fragile peace. And did he listen? Miss Marple pressed. Not entirely, Alton replied. He was passionate, driven by his art and the truth it could expose. I went to plead once more, but when I arrived, the door was locked. I left shortly after, feeling helpless. Inspector Crail studied him carefully. Did anyone see you? No, the vicar said. It was quiet. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And the figure Mrs. Carswell mentioned. Any idea who that might have been? Alton shook his head. I cannot say. Their interview was interrupted by a sudden knock. Clarissa Nash entered, her expression composed but her eyes betraying a turmoil beneath. Reverend, she said softly, may I speak with you? Privately. Alton nodded, and the two moved to the adjoining room. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Crail. The family's entanglements ran deeper than anticipated. Left alone, Miss Marple reflected on the vicar's words. His concern for the village's reputation seemed genuine, yet passion sometimes blinds the best of men. The figure trailing him remained a mystery, a shadow weaving through the night's events. Later that day, Miss Marple made her way to Oliver Nash's cottage. The quaint building stood quietly among budding trees, its windows catching the afternoon light. Inside, the air was thick with the faint scent of oil paint and turpentine. A studio frozen in time. She examined the room carefully. Easels stood ready, brushes dried in jars, and the covered portrait remained shrouded in silence. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on a small table near the window, where a leather-bound notebook lay half open. Curious, she flipped through the pages. Sketches intertwined with hurried notes, fragments of letters and names. Some familiar, others not. One entry caught her attention. A list of villagers, marked with annotations such as debt, betrayal, and promise broken. Her fingers traced the words, piecing together the web of relationships Oliver had meticulously documented. It was more than a portrait. It was a ledger of grievances, a map of sins cloaked by polite smiles. As she pondered the significance, a soft knock came from the door. Miss Marple turned to see Kitty Denham, her face pale and tense. Miss Marple, Kitty said quietly, I thought I might find you here. There's something I forgot to mention. Do sit down, dear, Miss Marple said kindly. What is it? Kitty hesitated, then blurted. Last night, after the garden party ended, I saw Simon Carriage near the orchard gate. He seemed agitated, looking around as if afraid of being seen. Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with interest. Did you speak with him? No, I was too afraid. But when I left, I saw him slip into the shadows near Oliver's cottage. Thank you, Kitty. That is very helpful. As Kitty left, Miss Marple sat back, contemplating this new thread. Simon Carriage, already under scrutiny for his disputes with Oliver, was acting furtively. Was fear driving him, or something darker? In the fading light, Miss Marple returned to the vicarage, where the inspector awaited news. They shared what had been learned, the pieces falling into place, yet the full picture remained elusive. The evening brought a summons to the village hall, where the assembled villagers awaited news. The tension was palpable as Inspector Crail addressed the crowd. "We have uncovered new evidence that sheds light on Mr. Nash's last hours," he announced. "But before we proceed, I urge everyone to remain calm. The truth will emerge in due course." Miss Marple watched the faces. Some pale, others guarded. Each harbored secrets, and each could be hiding more than they wished. After the meeting dispersed, Miss Marple found herself standing near the orchard gate, the cool night air brushing against her cheeks. Her gaze fell upon the darkened outline of Oliver Nash's cottage, the stillness broken only by the faint rustle of leaves. Her mind was alive with questions. Who had followed the vicar? Why had Simon been lurking near the orchard? What was the true nature of the letters? The portrait, still veiled and unshown, seemed to hold all the answers. But it was clear now that the truth was entangled in human fears, desires, and the fragile facades maintained by the villagers. Miss Marple knew that in the days to come, the quiet village of Crowthorne would reveal more shadows cast not by the moon, but by the secrets that lurked in the hearts of its people. And as the night deepened, she prepared herself for the delicate work ahead, unraveling the mystery with the subtlety and patience that only she could muster, one small detail at a time. The next morning dawned grey and misty, the village wrapped in a damp chill that seemed to seep into the very bones of its inhabitants. Miss Marple, having spent a restless night turning over the tangled threads of the mystery in her mind, dressed carefully and made her way to the village shop. The small bell tinkled softly as she entered, and the usual murmur of greetings was tinged with nervous energy. Several villagers stood clustered near the counter, exchanging low whispers. Miss Marple caught fragments of their conversations, references to secret meetings, hushed warnings, and a palpable unease that had settled over Crowthorne since Oliver Nash's death. The shopkeeper, Mrs. Hedges, spotted Miss Marple and gave her a cautious smile. "Morning, Jane. Things are a bit unsettled, aren't they?" "Indeed, Margaret," Miss Marple replied, returning the smile. "The storm before the calm, as it were. Have you noticed anything unusual recently?" Mrs. Hedges hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "Well, there's been talk about Simon Kerridge. Some say he's been seen out late, pacing near the orchard, looking over his shoulder as if someone were after him." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Margaret. It's important to notice what others might overlook." As she left the shop, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Simon Kerridge and the portrait's dark implications. She decided to visit the Kerridge estate that afternoon. Simon's family home was a large, somewhat austere manor on the outskirts of the village, its tall windows reflecting the grey skies above. She was greeted at the door by Simon himself, his appearance more dishevelled than usual, eyes shadowed by worry. "Miss Marple," he said, attempting a smile that failed to reach his eyes. "What a surprise. To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I thought a visit might be in order," she said gently. "I wish to discuss Oliver Nash and the recent events." Simon's jaw tightened. "I assume you're referring to the letters?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. It seems Mr. Nash's final work stirred quite a few troubled waters." He gestured her into a sitting room where a fire burned low in the grate. "Oliver was a man of principles, but sometimes those principles made enemies. The letters you found, they're accurate enough. I feared exposure. There were dealings, some that I regret, that would not withstand public scrutiny." "Is it true, then, that you were near the orchard on the night of the murder?" Simon's eyes flickered with unease. "I was, but not for the reasons people suspect." "Do tell," Miss Marple encouraged. He sighed heavily. "I received a message from Oliver earlier that day, threatening to reveal everything at the garden party. I thought if I could speak to him privately, perhaps I could dissuade him or at least prepare." "And did you find him?" "No," Simon replied, his voice low. "I waited near the orchard gate, but he never appeared. When I left, I noticed figures moving near his cottage. I did not recognize them, but I could not shake the feeling that something was wrong." Miss Marple absorbed this quietly. noting the careful choice of words and the strain beneath his calm exterior. "And what of your relationship with Oliver beyond these debts and secrets?" Simon's gaze grew distant. "We were once friends, long ago. But ambition and pride drive men apart." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with understanding. "Indeed they do." Later, as she walked away from the carriage estate, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the vicar. If Simon's presence near the orchard was motivated by fear and an attempt to negotiate, what had the vicar been doing there? And who was the shadow that had followed him? That afternoon, she arranged to speak again with Clarissa Nash. They met in the rose garden behind the vicarage, where the soft colours of spring offered a brief respite from the village's gloom. "Clarissa," Miss Marple began, "have you noticed any changes in your family recently? Anyone acting unusually?" Clarissa sighed. "There's been tension, certainly. My father, Oliver, became obsessed with exposing the truth no matter the cost. And since his death, there's a palpable fear among us all." Miss Marple nodded. "And your mother, Mrs. Eversham?" Clarissa's eyes narrowed slightly. "She is upset, but she hides it well. There are things about my mother that even I don't fully understand." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Sometimes understanding takes time." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the vicar, who greeted them both with an air of strained civility. "Miss Marple, Clarissa," he said, "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Reverend," Miss Marple replied smoothly. "I wanted to discuss the letters again," Alton said. "I've been reflecting on their contents. It is clear that many in the village are involved in questionable dealings. But the question remains, who would kill to keep those secrets buried?" Miss Marple glanced between the two, sensing the unspoken undercurrents swirling beneath their words. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the person least suspected is the one who feels they have the most to lose." The vicar's eyes flickered briefly, but he said nothing. Later, Miss Marple found herself once more in Oliver Nash's cottage, poring over the letters with renewed attention. One particular envelope, yellowed with age and bearing a delicate seal, caught her eye. Inside was a note, written in a hurried hand, hinting at a promise broken, something deeply personal. As she examined the note, a sudden knock startled her. It was Kitty Denham, looking pale but resolute. "Miss Marple," she said, "I have something you should see." Kitty produced a small, folded piece of paper from her pocket. It was a letter, unsigned, but with a tone of desperation and threat. "Where did you find this?" Miss Marple asked. Kitty bit her lip. "In my room. I don't know how it got there. I thought it was meant for Oliver." Miss Marple's mind raced. This new letter hinted at a blackmailer, someone who had been leveraging secrets for power. The following day, Inspector Crail convened another round of interviews. The village hall was thick with tension as each suspect was brought before him. Miss Marple observed quietly, noting the subtle shifts in demeanor, the quick glances, the hesitations, the carefully crafted words. Simon Kerridge remained guarded but cooperative, while Mrs. Eversham maintained her composure with practiced grace. Clarissa was composed but visibly strained. The vicar watched quietly, his calmness almost too perfect. At the close of the day, Miss Marple and the inspector shared a quiet moment. The letters and the suspicions seemed to circle around debts, betrayals, and blackmail, Crail said, but we lack direct evidence. Miss Marple nodded. Truths in a village are like threads woven through a tapestry. One pull unravels more than expected. "Do you suspect the vicar?" Crail asked cautiously. "Not yet," she replied, "but I intend to observe him more closely." As dusk settled, Miss Marple returned to the vicarage garden alone. The fading light cast long shadows, and the air was thick with unspoken tension. From the corner of her eye, she spotted movement near the hedge, a figure slipping away into the darkness. Her heart quickened. The game was far from over, and the shadows of Crowthorne were stirring once more. The figure paused just beyond the low hedge, the shadows cloaking their identity, but Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the subtle stiffness in their posture, the careful way they kept to the gloom. Without a sound, she slipped quietly along the garden path, keeping the hedge between them until the person moved again, stepping toward the narrow lane that bordered the village orchard. Miss Marple followed at a distance, her mind already piecing together the possibilities. The late hour, the furtive movements, this was no chance wanderer. Someone was trying to hide, to evade discovery. The village had been quiet for years, but in that silence, secrets had festered, growing like the tangled undergrowth of the orchard itself. The figure hurried down the lane and disappeared into the shadows beyond the last lamp-post. Miss Marple quickened her pace, but lost sight of them where the trees thickened. She stopped, listening to the faint rustle of leaves and distant church bells tolling the hour. Returning to the vicarage, her thoughts spun. The encounter had been brief, but revealing. Whoever it was had been near Oliver Nash's cottage, perhaps the same figure Mrs. Carswell had glimpsed trailing the vicar. Now, the question was whether this person was a witness or a participant in the tragedy. Inside, the vicar's study was silent, the only sound the ticking of an old clock. Miss Marple's gaze settled on the neat pile of letters and papers on the desk. She picked up a single sheet, a letter from Oliver, postmarked the day before his death. The words were urgent, pleading for discretion, but they hinted at a threat far more immediate than vague social scandal. As she read, the door opened softly. Reverend Alton entered, looking wearied yet composed. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect you still here," he said, though his eyes betrayed unease. "I could say the same," she replied gently. "I'm afraid this mystery has many layers, Reverend." He nodded, folding his hands. Oliver was a troubled man, consumed by the knowledge of what lay beneath our village's surface. He said as much, in his letters. "But I never imagined it would lead to such tragedy." "Nor I," she said softly. "But I wonder, Reverend, why did you follow him that night? And who was the shadow you failed to shake?" Alton's gaze darkened. "I only wanted to stop him, to protect this community. The truth, once unleashed, can destroy more than just reputations." Miss Marple considered his words carefully. "Do you think the threat was from within the village?" He hesitated. "Yes. Too many have secrets to guard. I fear Oliver's revelations threatened more than just individuals. They threatened the fragile peace we cling to." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock. Clarissa Nash entered, her expression tense but determined. "Father, I need to speak with you," she said quietly. "About the letters, and what they truly mean." The vicar nodded and gestured to a nearby chair. Clarissa's eyes flicked toward Miss Marple, who offered an encouraging smile before stepping back. As the two spoke in low tones, Miss Marple returned to the letters on the desk. One name recurred in Oliver's notes: Hugh Fitzwilliam, the local magistrate, known for his strict demeanor and influence over village affairs. Miss Marple had yet to speak with Fitzwilliam, and a visit seemed prudent. Perhaps the magistrate held the key to the tangled motives lurking beneath Crowthorne's genteel surface. Later that morning, she found herself at the Fitzwilliam estate, a grand but somber house set back from the main road. The magistrate greeted her with a cool, measured politeness. "Miss Marple," he said, leading her into a richly appointed study. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" "I'm investigating the circumstances surrounding Oliver Nash's death," she replied. "His letters mention your name several times. I wonder if you might share your thoughts." Fitzwilliam's eyes narrowed slightly. Oliver was a troublesome artist, prone to stirring discord. I'd hoped his latest project was simply another phase, but it seems I was mistaken. "Did you have cause to fear exposure?" Miss Marple asked gently. The magistrate's face tightened. Some truths are better left buried. I admit I was concerned that Oliver's revelations might upset the balance we maintain here. Miss Marple's gaze was steady. And what about the night of his death? Were you near the orchard? Fitzwilliam's lips pressed thin. I was attending a late meeting at the manor. I assure you, my involvement in this matter is purely incidental. As Miss Marple observed him, she noted the practiced calm that masked a deeper tension. His position afforded him power, but also enemies. Upon leaving the estate, Miss Marple's mind circled back to the growing list of suspects and motives. The vicar's shadowed movements, Simon Kerridge's furtive pacing, the magistrate's cold calculation, all threads in a fabric woven with fear and betrayal. Returning to the village, she stopped at the post office, where a small parcel awaited her, a package from an anonymous sender. Inside was a fragment of torn fabric, stained faintly with red, and a note. The portrait blushed the night it was finished. The message sent a chill down Miss Marple's spine. The portrait was more than a painting. It was a symbol, a silent witness to sins hidden in plain sight. Later that evening, as the village settled under a cloak of darkness, Miss Marple sat by the fire, reviewing her notes. The pieces were falling into place, each revelation casting new shadows, each suspect guarding secrets sharper than knives. She knew the next steps would be delicate, interviews to unsettle, observations to catch the faintest slip of truth. The true killer remained hidden, cloaked in the familiar faces of Crowthorne's respectable society. But Miss Marple's mind was steady, her resolve unshaken. For beneath the village's peaceful veneer, the portrait that blushed red held the final secret, and she would uncover it, one careful stitch at a time. The following morning, the village of Crowthorne awoke to a mist that clung to the earth like a shroud, softening edges and muting colors. Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the quiet unease that lingered beneath the surface of everyday life. The market square, usually bustling with neighbors exchanging pleasantries, felt subdued as though the villagers were holding their breath. Miss Marple began her day with a visit to the local pub, the Fox and Hound, where gossip flourished and tempers occasionally flared in equal measure. She took a seat near the fire, ordering a modest pot of tea and listening intently as conversations drifted by. The villagers spoke in low tones about the ongoing investigation, their voices weaving a tapestry of speculation and fear. At a corner table sat Mrs. Dalloway, the postmistress, her eyes darting nervously as she whispered to her companion. Miss Marple caught fragments of their conversation, references to a secret meeting held late at night, a warning delivered in haste, and a game played too far. Miss Marple's mind turned over these clues. A secret meeting, a warning. The phrase, "game played too far," struck a chord, recalling the fragile alliances and veiled threats that seemed to underpin village life. Leaving the pub, Miss Marple made her way toward the vicarage, where she intended to speak again with Reverend Alton. As she approached, she noticed a figure retreating quickly from the garden gate. Mrs. Eversham, her face flushed and eyes wide with agitation. "Good morning, Mrs. Eversham," Miss Marple called gently. The woman paused, composing herself. "May I have a word?" With a hesitant nod, Mrs. Eversham allowed Miss Marple to follow her into the parlor. The room was impeccably kept, but there was a tension in the air that seemed almost palpable. "Jane," Mrs. Eversham began, using Miss Marple's first name with unexpected familiarity. "I fear things are unraveling faster than we can control. Oliver's death has stirred more than just sorrow. It has awakened old resentments and fears. Do you believe the killer is among us?" Miss Marple asked softly. Mrs. Eversham's eyes filled with tears. "I do, and I fear for my daughter, Clarissa. She is more involved than she lets on. There are secrets she keeps, not just from us, but from herself." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "What kind of secrets?" Mrs. Eversham hesitated, then spoke in a whisper. Long ago, before Clarissa was born, there was an incident, a scandal involving the Fitzwilliam family. Oliver discovered it and threatened to reveal it. That's why he worked so tirelessly on his letters. The name Fitzwilliam resurfaced, a thread Miss Marple had begun to pull at during her recent visit to the magistrate's estate. Could this scandal be the root of the village's tangled web? Later, Miss Marple found herself at the Fitzwilliam estate once again, requesting a private meeting with Hugh Fitzwilliam. The magistrate greeted her with a tight smile and an unyielding gaze. "Miss Marple," he said smoothly, "to what do I owe this second visit?" "I hope you don't mind, but I have more questions about your family's history," she replied, watching him carefully. "Mrs. Evesham mentioned a scandal, something from years ago that Oliver Nash uncovered. Can you shed any light?" Fitzwilliam's face darkened, the carefully controlled veneer slipping for a moment. "It was a regrettable affair, yes. A youthful indiscretion involving my late brother and a member of the village. Oliver believed it worth exposing, but I persuaded him otherwise, for the sake of the family's reputation." "And did Oliver agree?" Miss Marple pressed gently. "No," Fitzwilliam admitted, his voice low. "He vowed to publish everything, regardless of the consequences." Miss Marple studied him silently. "And yet, here we are, with Oliver dead and his letters half finished. What do you think happened?" The magistrate's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "I can only say that in matters of reputation and secrecy, the truth is a dangerous commodity." With that, he rose abruptly, signaling the end of the conversation. As Miss Marple walked back through the village, her mind was a swirl of connections. The scandal had been kept under wraps for decades, but its echoes had reached even the newest generations. If Oliver had intended to expose it, someone with much to lose might have felt compelled to silence him. Her next call was to Simon Kerridge, whose recent nervousness had not escaped her notice. Simon was in his study when she arrived, surrounded by ledgers and papers. "Miss Marple," he greeted her warily. "I gather you have more questions." "Only that I hope you can help me understand your movements on the night Oliver died," she said calmly. "You mentioned waiting near the orchard, but did you see anyone?" Simon looked away, fingers twitching. "I saw Reverend Alton pass by looking troubled, but after that a figure appeared. A woman, I think. She moved quickly, almost furtively, disappearing into the shadows near the hedgerow." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Do you know who she was?" Simon shook his head. "No, but it troubled me. It felt like a warning or a threat." Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Clarissa Nash entered, her expression guarded but resolute. "I need to speak with you," she said to Simon, then to Miss Marple. "There's more to this than you know. My father's death was not a simple matter of secrets and debts." Miss Marple gestured for her to continue. Clarissa took a deep breath. "There's a man, a stranger who's been asking questions. Someone who wants to uncover the truth at any cost. I fear he may be the one behind the threats." "Who is this man?" Miss Marple asked. Clarissa hesitated. "I don't know his name, but he was seen near the village last week asking about the portrait. Some say he's connected to the art world, but others think he has darker motives." Miss Marple's mind raced. The portrait, the one that had blushed red as the note said, was clearly more than just a piece of art. It was a symbol of everything Oliver had tried to expose. That evening, Miss Marple arranged a meeting with Inspector Crail. In the quiet of his office, she laid out her thoughts. "The web of secrets runs deep," she said. "There's a scandal involving the Fitzwilliams, a mysterious stranger, and fears that have poisoned this village. We must be cautious." Crail frowned. "You think this stranger is still here?" "I do," Miss Marple replied, "and he may be the key to unraveling the mystery. But we must not overlook those closest to the victim, the ones with the most to lose." The inspector nodded slowly. "I'll increase patrols and keep an eye out, but it's difficult when everyone seems to be hiding something." Miss Marple smiled faintly. That is precisely why the truth will come to light, one quiet observation at a time. As the night deepened, Miss Marple sat by the window, her gaze drifting toward the village rooftops silhouetted against the moonlit sky. The portrait's blush seemed to linger in her thoughts, a silent reminder that beneath Crowthorne's tranquil surface, passion, fear, and betrayal simmered dangerously close to breaking free. Tomorrow, she decided, would bring new revelations, and with them, the next step toward justice. Morning brought a brittle chill to Crowthorne, the kind that hinted at summer's end, but held winter's sharpness just beyond the horizon. Miss Marple, having spent the previous evening piecing together the strands of suspicion and fear, now felt the weight of urgency pressing on her. Each day the village remained cloaked in silence was a day closer to further damage. Another life could unravel in the tangled web of secrets. She rose early, the household quiet save for the soft rustle of the morning paper and the occasional clink of a teacup. Her mind replayed Clarissa's words about the stranger, the elusive figure who had begun stirring unrest with his probing questions about the portrait. If this visitor truly was connected to the art world, then he was no mere curiosity seeker. He must have a stake in the mystery Oliver Nash had sought to expose. After a brief breakfast, Miss Marple set off toward the village centre. Her first stop was the post office, where she hoped to catch Mrs. Dalloway before the day's flood of parcels and letters began. The postmistress was already bustling behind the counter, exchanging pleasantries with early customers, but her eyes brightened with recognition when she saw Miss Marple. "Good morning, Jane," Mrs. Dalloway said warmly. "I heard there's been more talk about that strange man. Came in again yesterday afternoon, asking questions about the Nash property and the portrait." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Do you know anything about where he might be staying?" Mrs. Dalloway's brow furrowed. "He's not registered anywhere official, I'm afraid. But there was a carriage spotted outside the old Miller farmstead on the edge of the village. It's been empty for years, though some say it's sometimes used by travellers passing through." "The Miller farmstead," Miss Marple repeated quietly. "Thank you, Mrs. Dalloway. That is very helpful." With that, she stepped outside and made her way toward the far edge of the village. The path to the Miller farmstead wound past overgrown hedgerows and neglected fields where wildflowers struggled against the creeping vines of ivy. The farm itself was a melancholy sight, its weather-beaten timbers bowed beneath years of disuse, windows boarded up except for one at the back that was cracked open just enough to let in a breeze. Miss Marple approached cautiously and called softly, "Is anyone home?" Her voice was answered by a faint movement inside the shadows. Moments later, a man emerged, a tall figure clad in a long coat that seemed to absorb the morning light. His eyes were sharp, his demeanor guarded. "May I help you?" he asked with a clipped accent that Miss Marple couldn't quite place. "I'm Miss Marple," she introduced herself calmly. "I've heard you've been asking questions about Oliver Nash and his portrait." The man studied her with an intensity that suggested he was weighing his words carefully. "That would be Mr. Ashcombe. I'm an art dealer, investigating a matter of provenance regarding some of Oliver Nash's recent work." Miss Marple smiled slightly, her eyes brightening with recognition. "I suspected you might be connected to the art world. And what, pray tell, has brought you to Crowthorne with such particular interest?" Ashcombe's expression hardened. "Let's just say some things are worth protecting, and some truths are dangerous. I believe Mr. Nash uncovered something that should have remained hidden." "Then you are aware of the scandal?" Miss Marple pressed gently. Ashcombe nodded, his gaze flickering to the boarded windows. "More than most, that portrait, the blushing maiden, is not just a painting. It is a confession, a puzzle that, if solved, could destroy several reputations." "Do you know who might want to keep it secret?" Miss Marple asked. "The Fitzwilliams, naturally," he replied sharply, "and anyone tied to their past. There are forces here that would go to great lengths to ensure silence." Miss Marple allowed the moment to settle between them before speaking again. "Mr. Ashcombe, Do you believe the man who killed Oliver Nash is among those forces? Ashcombe's eyes darkened. Yes, and I fear I may be next if I don't tread carefully. The weight of his words hung in the air as Miss Marple considered the new angle the stranger brought to her investigation. If Ashcombe's fears were true, then the village was more dangerous than she had imagined. With a polite nod, she took her leave, her thoughts turning to the magistrate and the vicar, men with influence and secrets entwined with the very fabric of Crowthorne. If the portrait was indeed a confession, then the killer must have known how damaging its truth could be. Returning to the village, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage, where Reverend Alton awaited. The vicar received her with a grave expression, clearly unsettled by recent events. "I spoke with Mr. Ashcombe," Miss Marple began carefully. "He confirmed the portrait is more than art. It is a revelation." Alton sighed heavily. "I feared as much. The longer this drags on, the more I worry about what might come next." "Do you think the new visitor has uncovered something Oliver missed?" she asked. "It's possible," Alton admitted. "But more dangerous still is what remains hidden in the shadows. Old grudges, jealousy, and fear." Miss Marple regarded the vicar thoughtfully. "You have been protecting the village all your life. Do you feel it is slipping beyond your control?" The vicar looked away, a flicker of pain crossing his face. "Yes. The peace I cherished feels fragile, like glass ready to shatter." Her own resolve hardened. The time had come to confront the tangled web directly. She needed to bring the suspects together, to observe their interactions and watch for the slightest crack in their carefully constructed facades. That afternoon, Miss Marple sent invitations to those most closely linked to the mystery: Clarissa Nash, Hugh Fitzwilliam, Simon Kerridge, Reverend Alton, and the enigmatic Ashcombe. She proposed a gathering at the vicarage under the pretense of discussing Oliver's estate and the future of his works. One by one, the guests arrived, their faces a mixture of apprehension and guarded curiosity. Miss Marple welcomed them with her usual quiet grace, offering tea and steadying smiles. As the afternoon wore on, conversations began tentatively, touching on memories of Oliver, the village's history, and the haunting portrait that seemed to watch over them all. Miss Marple listened intently, noting the subtle glances exchanged, the hesitation in certain voices, and the fleeting expressions that betrayed more than words. Simon's fingers trembled slightly as he spoke of the orchard. Clarissa's eyes flashed when Fitzwilliam mentioned the past, and Ashcombe's gaze flickered with thinly veiled distrust toward the magistrate. The atmosphere grew taut, like the string of a bow drawn tight, ready to snap. As the gathering moved toward its close, Miss Marple quietly observed a small, almost imperceptible detail, a tremor in Fitzwilliam's hand, as Clarissa mentioned the torn fabric found in the letter, and a swift, barely noticeable glance exchanged between the magistrate and Reverend Alton. The threads were converging, tensions rising, and beneath the calm veneer of polite society, the truth pulsed, waiting to be revealed. Miss Marple knew that the next move was crucial. She would need to set her trap with care, to play the psychological game that would force the guilty party into revealing themselves without a single misstep. For now, the portrait's blush deepened in her thoughts, a silent, steadfast witness to the unfolding drama in the heart of Crowthorne. The evening settled over Crowthorne with a quiet solemnity, the fading light casting long shadows across the village green. Inside the vicarage, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tensions, the gathering that Miss Marple had orchestrated lingering in the air like a slow-burning fuse. Each guest had departed, leaving her alone with her thoughts, and the silent portrait that seemed to glow faintly in the dim candlelight. Miss Marple stood by the hearth, her gaze drifting toward the heavy frame of the blushing maiden, now removed from the public eye but etched indelibly in her mind. The portrait's subtle, knowing expression had always struck her as unusual, too alive for mere paint and canvas. She understood now that it was not just a likeness, but a coded confession, a map of hidden truths cloaked in artistry. Her mind traced the strands of the day, the fluttering exchanges, the minute gestures, the barely perceptible tensions that had coiled tighter with each conversation. Simon Kerridge's nervous energy, Clarissa Nash's steely resolve, Hugh Fitzwilliam's strained composure, Reverend Alton's carefully measured words, and Ashcombe's guarded wariness. They were all pieces on a board set for checkmate, but the final move had yet to be played. She recalled Ashcombe's warning about the lengths to which some would go to keep the secrets buried. It was no longer merely about a scandal. It was a battle over legacy, reputation, and survival. Oliver Nash had unwittingly become the catalyst, disturbing old graves and stirring ghosts best left undisturbed. Resolving to bring clarity to the shadows, Miss Marple decided that a deliberate confrontation was needed. The subtle psychological game she had hinted at earlier must now take form, a gathering where the pressure could be applied gently but firmly, where the cracks in the facades might be coaxed open by nothing more than the careful placement of words and the delicate art of observation. The following morning, the village awoke to a brisk breeze that stirred the leaves and scattered the last remnants of summer. Miss Marple, serene and purposeful, sent word inviting the key players to meet once again. This time at her own home, a cozy cottage nestled on the village's edge, where distractions were few and privacy assured. By mid-afternoon, the visitors arrived, each carrying the weight of the past and the uncertainty of what was to come. Miss Marple greeted them with gentle hospitality, offering tea and warm smiles, while quietly noting their demeanors. The taut lines around Fitzwilliam's mouth, Clarissa's guarded eyes, Simon's restless fingers, Reverend Alton's composed posture, and Ashcombe's cautious gaze. As they settled in the sitting room, Miss Marple began with a simple recounting of Oliver Nash's final days, the events leading to his death, and the enigmatic portrait that had cast a long shadow over the village. She spoke carefully, never accusing, but weaving a narrative that drew each person's attention to the threads that connected them all. Her eyes rested briefly on the torn fabric mentioned before, the fragment of a letter found hidden in Oliver's papers, now carefully placed on the mantelpiece. Sometimes, she mused softly, the smallest detail can unravel the most carefully held secrets. She then turned her attention to the portrait itself. The blushing maiden is not just an artwork, but a message, a piece of history concealed beneath layers of paint and propriety. Oliver believed it revealed a truth so dangerous that some would kill to protect it. A hush fell over the room. Ashcombe's face tightened, Clarissa's fingers clenched her teacup, and Fitzwilliam's gaze dropped to the floor. The atmosphere was taut, charged with the electric tension of unspoken guilt and fear. Miss Marple allowed the silence to deepen before continuing. "I've watched each of you carefully, noting the way you speak and the things you avoid. It is clear that each of you carries a burden connected to that portrait, whether it be love, jealousy, fear, or regret." Her gaze swept across the room, lingering on Fitzwilliam last. "Mr. Fitzwilliam, you spoke of honor and legacy earlier. Yet when Clarissa mentioned the torn letter, your hand betrayed you, a tremor so slight that only a keen eye might catch it. What is it that you fear so deeply?" Fitzwilliam swallowed hard, his voice barely more than a whisper. There are things from the past, things I wished to keep hidden. Oliver's discovery threatened to bring them all to light." Miss Marple nodded gently. "And you are not alone in this. Reverend Alton, your calm words conceal a knowledge that seems more than pastoral care. And Simon, your restlessness suggests a deeper anxiety than mere orchard troubles." The vicar's expression was unreadable, but Simon shifted uneasily, meeting Miss Marple's eyes with a mix of defiance and resignation. Clarissa, meanwhile, remained still, her composure unbroken, though her eyes flickered with an unspoken storm. Miss Marple then directed her attention to Ashcombe. Mr. Ashcombe, you warned of danger and protective forces. What is it you intend to do now that Oliver is gone?" Ashcombe's voice was steady but edged with weariness. "To find the truth and ensure it is known, no matter the cost." As the conversation unfolded, layers of the village's tangled history began to surface. The faded scandal involving the Fitzwilliams, the whispered alliances and betrayals, and the concealed emotions that had fermented over decades. Miss Marple's skillful questioning drew out revelations that seemed to prick the very air with tension. Then, sensing that the moment was ripe, she shifted tone. Sometimes, when the truth is hidden, it takes a test, a subtle provocation, to reveal the guilty party's reaction. A question, a suggestion, or a glance that cannot be denied. She paused, letting the room hold its breath. "I would like to share a detail I have kept back until now. Something that may seem insignificant, but, when understood, alters the entire picture." She reached for the torn letter fragment on the mantelpiece and held it up. This letter was not just torn by chance. The fabric stuck to it, faint but unmistakable, belongs to a very particular garment, one that I have reason to believe was worn by the murderer on the day Oliver Nash was killed. Eyes followed the letter as Miss Marple carefully described the pattern and texture, details that had escaped notice in the initial investigation, but now glowed with newfound significance. A sudden movement broke the stillness. Fitzwilliam's hand jerked involuntarily, and a faint flush colored his cheeks. Clarissa's gaze narrowed, sharp and probing, while Simon's fingers twitched with renewed tension. Reverend Alton's face remained composed, but his eyes darted briefly toward the door. Miss Marple watched closely, noting each reaction with the precision of a surgeon. Would anyone care to explain how such a fabric could be found on this letter? The room seemed to contract, the weight of her question pressing on each guest. Silence stretched, fragile and brittle. Then, unexpectedly, Clarissa Nash spoke. Her voice was low but firm, carrying the authority of someone who had decided to unburden themselves. "I wore that dress that day." The words sent a ripple through the room. "Clarissa," Miss Marple said gently, "do you mean to say you were at the scene of Oliver's death?" Clarissa's eyes gleamed with a complex mix of pain and resolve. "I was there. I confronted Oliver. He had threatened to reveal everything, to destroy us all with that portrait. I begged him to stop, but he refused." Her admission hung in the air like a candle flickering in a draught. "And then I left," she whispered. "But the truth is, I did not kill him. I loved Oliver once, in my own way. I only wanted him to be silent." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, then looked around the room. If not Clarissa, then who? The murderer must have been someone who knew both the secret and the consequences of its revelation. It was Reverend Alton who spoke next, his voice calm but resolute. "I feared this day would come. The truth has been a poison, but so too has the fear that kept us silent. It is time to end this." Suddenly, the door creaked open, and the constable entered, carrying a small package. Miss Marple, this was found near the orchard where Mr. Nash was discovered. She took the parcel carefully and opened it. Inside was a scrap of fabric matching the torn piece, but with a fresh, unmistakable stain. The room held its breath. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, the final pieces beginning to fall into place. The game was nearly won, and soon the portrait's blush would reveal the face it had concealed all along. As the dimming light of evening settled once more over Crowthorne, Miss Marple gathered the small group in her cozy sitting room, the atmosphere heavy with anticipation. The torn fabric, the stained scrap found near the orchard, the tangled web of half-truths and long-buried secrets, all were threads now pulled taut, ready to unravel. Miss Marple began with quiet deliberation, her voice gentle yet firm. "We have seen how fear and love, loyalty and betrayal have all played their parts in this tragic tale. Each of you holds a piece of the puzzle, yet the final picture remains incomplete. She turned to Clarissa Nash first, her eyes soft but searching. "You were at the scene, as you admitted. You confronted Oliver Nash with a plea for silence, but you did not strike the fatal blow." Clarissa's lips tightened, but she nodded. "No, I did not kill him. Though I feared the consequences, I could not bring myself to do such a thing." Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Reverend Alton. "You have spoken of the poison of secrets. You, more than most, understood the danger the portrait represented." The vicar's calm exterior showed the slightest tremor of unease. "Indeed, I feared exposure would bring ruin, not just to individuals, but to the entire village." "And yet," Miss Marple continued, "there is one among us whose actions were driven not only by fear, but by a desperate need to protect a legacy. Legacy stained by past misdeeds." Her eyes settled finally on Hugh Fitzwilliam, who had grown increasingly pale, the strain of concealment etched deeply upon his face. "You, Mr. Fitzwilliam, attempted to control the narrative of this village's history, going so far as to silence the one man who threatened to reveal the truth." Fitzwilliam's composure shattered. "It was necessary. Oliver Nash would have destroyed everything my family built. I only wanted to protect what was rightfully mine." Miss Marple nodded gently, the last pieces clicking into place. "But protection turned to murder, and the cost has been greater than any of us imagined." The torn fabric and the stained scrap were not just accidental clues. They were the vestiges of the fatal struggle beneath the portrait's watchful gaze. As the constable moved to take Fitzwilliam into custody, the room breathed a collective sigh of relief, the weight of suspicion lifting with the truth now laid bare. Miss Marple, serene as ever, looked toward the portrait. The blushing maiden held its secrets well, but human nature reveals all in time, and it is in the quiet observation of small things, gestures, glances, hesitations, that the greatest mysteries are solved. The village of Crowthorne would never be quite the same, but peace had returned, fragile and hard-won. And as Miss Marple settled by her fire that night, she reflected once more on the complexities of the human heart, ever the greatest mystery of all.